Okay, so um, today we're going like deep, deep into something really relevant, I think, especially right now, deconstructing narratives.
Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at the Israeli narrative, kind of how its history and religion are all woven into its politics, with everything that's going on in Gaza.
I mean, what's fascinating here is how these narratives shape the way we see history. They even like
Right.
influence perceptions and justify actions.
Right. And our guide for this whole thing is going to be Palestinian writer and historian Ahmed Al-Dabash. He spent decades studying the Torah
Ah.
and its relationship to Palestinian history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, offers a really unique perspective, I
I'll
think.
bet, yeah.
And, you know, Al-Dabash kind of encourages us to look at history through, I don't know, a wider lens, right? To consider archaeology and diverse sources instead of just accepting a single narrative as the truth.
Hmm.
So it brings up, some pretty big questions, I think, about like the foundations of the Israeli narrative and, what it means for understanding the conflict. So let's start with Al-Dabash's journey. Uh, he initially tried to relocate like the whole geography of the Torah to Yemen based on linguistic similarities and archaeological findings.
Wow.
Yeah, like can you imagine placing those biblical events in a totally different location?
That's a big shift. Yeah.
Yeah, so he eventually rejected this theory, though, concluding that the biblical narrative, particularly like the Old Testament, it lacks sufficient archaeological evidence to support its claims within the Middle East.
Interesting.
Yeah. And what's particularly striking, I think, is his argument that the Torah, especially the Old Testament, it might actually function more as like a political tool than a purely religious text.
Oh, wow. So he's
Yeah.
really making a statement there.
How does he support that? What's he basing that on?
Well, he points to how different groups throughout history, I mean, from like the Greeks and the Romans to the Crusaders, even Protestants, they've all used the Torah to kind of justify their actions and their claims to certain regions.
Hmm.
So it's like he's suggesting this whole narrative has almost been used as a blueprint for like conquest and control, across different times and places.
Yeah, he even compares the biblical narrative to the American colonists, seeing themselves as like the Israelites fleeing Egypt with the Native Americans cast as the Canaanites,
Oh, wow.
which is pretty stark comparison, I think, that highlights how narratives can be used to justify displacement and oppression, in really horrible ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us to Al-Dabash's critique of the Zionist movement's claim to Palestine.
Okay.
He's arguing that it's rooted in a religious myth that lacks historical and archaeological backing.
So he's directly like going after that whole idea of a land without a people for a people without a land.
Precisely. Yeah, he points to archaeological evidence showing like continuous human presence in Palestine for over 1 million years.
Wow.
So that directly contradicts the notion that Palestine was like this empty land just waiting for the Israelites.
So how does this then tie into contemporary politics, specifically what's happening in Gaza right now?
Right. Well, Eldabash argues that this historical narrative it continues to shape the actions of Israeli leaders today, particularly like figures like Netanyahu.
Uh-huh.
He points to Netanyahu's, frequent use of religious language and imagery, even though Israel presents itself as a secular state.
Yeah, right. You mean like those speeches he gave at the beginning of the recent Gaza war?
Exactly. Like Al-Dabash highlights how Netanyahu invoked all these biblical stories and figures,
Hmm.
almost framing the conflict in these apocalyptic terms.
Hmm.
He even referenced Joshua, who, if you remember from the Bible, is associated with conquest and violence, which suggests this direct link between the ancient narrative and modern day action.
So it's like he's using the Bible as a justification for military action.
And Al-Dabash argues that this isn't just symbolic, but it actually reflects a deep-seated belief system, within Israeli society that sees the conflict through this religious lens, even among those who identify as secular.
It's like the narrative shapes the actions, and those actions then reinforce the narrative.
Exactly. It's this like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And that's where understanding Netanyahu's background becomes really crucial, according to Al-Dabash.
Okay, let's unpack that then. What are the key factors that El-Dabash identifies in Netanyahu's background?
Well, he starts with his grandfather, a staunch Zionist who rejected the idea of settling Jews anywhere but Palestine.
Hmm.
And then you have his father, a historian, who instilled in him this belief in Jewish vulnerability and the need for a strong Israel for protection.
Right.
And of course, the profound impact of his brother Yoni's death during the Entebbe raid.
Yoni became a national hero in
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah, absolutely. And Aldabash argues that these figures, along with the writings of this revisionist Zionist leader, Jabotinsky, they instilled in Netanyahu this deep sense of Jewish exceptionalism. It's this belief in like a divine right to exist and expand.
It seems like he's really trying to get into the mindset of the enemy, so to speak.
Yeah.
Why does Aldabash think that's important?
He believes that understanding the motivations and the beliefs of these key players like Netanyahu is crucial for analyzing the conflict effectively. He argues that without understanding the other side's perspective, any attempt at a resolution is just doomed to fail.
So it's not just about critiquing the narrative,
Right.
but it's about understanding the people who believe in it and act on it.
Precisely, and that brings us to another fascinating point, Aldabash's discussion of the 8th decade prophecy that's circulating in Israel.
What is that exactly? I've never heard of it.
So it's this prophecy that suggests that no Jewish state has lasted for more than 80 years, making 2028 a potential turning point,
Oh.
a real point of anxiety for some.
And of course, we have Netanyahu vowing to break that prophecy, promising to secure Israel for 100 years if he stays in power.
Yeah, Aldabash argues that this prophecy, whether it's true or not, has a really powerful psychological hold, within Israeli society, creating this sense of urgency and even desperation that could fuel even more extreme policies.
So this, sense of impending doom could actually be driving the very actions that might lead to its fulfillment. That's a scary thought.
Exactly. And Aldabash suggests that this fear is being exploited by politicians like Netanyahu to justify a hardline stance against any compromise.
So fear becomes a tool of manipulation, a way to maintain power and control. It's a scary thought. Makes you wonder how much of this whole conflict is driven by fear rather than, rational decision-making.
That's a big question that Aldabash wants us to ponder. He believes that fear, especially when it's exploited, it can lead to these irrational and destructive behaviors, even on a national scale.
Okay, so we've established that Aldabash is deeply critical of the Israeli narrative and how it's been used to justify certain actions. But he doesn't just stop at critique, does he?
Yeah.
He also offers a counter-narrative, right? Like a different way of understanding Palestinian history and identity.
That's right. He shifts gears and focuses on reconstructing a Palestinian narrative based on archaeology, independent of the biblical account. And he highlights Jericho, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, and its significance in the development of early civilization.
So he's trying to reclaim the narrative, to show that Palestinian history and civilization existed long before the events described in the Bible.
Precisely. Yeah, he wants to demonstrate that Palestinian identity is not dependent on or defined by the Israeli narrative. He's arguing for a Palestinian history that stands on its own, rooted in archaeological evidence and independent of these biblical interpretations.
It's like he's saying, we have our own story to tell, and it's just as valid and important as any other.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Aldabash argues that this Palestinian counter-narrative is essential for challenging the dominant narrative and asserting a Palestinian perspective that's rooted in, historical and archaeological evidence. He believes that by reclaiming their narrative, Palestinians can reclaim their agency and their rightful place in history.
This is getting really fascinating. So he's deconstructed the Israeli narrative, explored the psychology of its proponents, and offered a counter-narrative.
Right.
Where does he go from there?
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Aldabash unpacks the specific strategies that Israel uses to maintain control and advance its narrative.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. I'm eager to hear more about how he connects these historical and religious ideas to the real-world actions and policies we see playing out today.
It's definitely a thought-provoking exploration and one that I think will leave you with a lot to consider.
I'm sure it will.
So, picking up where we left off, one of the key strategies that Aldabash highlights is how Israel has used archaeology to bolster its claims to the land.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's for decades, Israeli archaeologists have been excavating sites in Palestine, but Aldabash argues that their approach is inherently biased.
Biased in what way? How?
Well, he suggests that they're kind of starting with the conclusion already in mind.
Okay.
That the biblical narrative is historically accurate, and then they try to fit the evidence to that conclusion.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like, rewriting history through archaeology.
Trying to force it to fit their narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And he gives the example of the search for King David's palace.
Right.
Despite decades of excavations, there's still no conclusive evidence to support the biblical account of this grand palace in Jerusalem.
Okay.
Yet the idea persists because it reinforces that image of this ancient and powerful Jewish kingdom in Palestine.
Yeah, it's not just about historical accuracy anymore. It's about using archaeology to like support a very specific narrative
Yeah.
that has these real-world political implications.
Precisely. And Aldabash argues that these archaeological claims, they're then used to justify things like the expansion of settlements and the seizure of Palestinian land.
Oh, wow. So they're literally digging up evidence to support their political agenda.
Yeah, it's a pretty serious accusation, but it's not just about archaeology either.
Right. What else?
He also talks about how Israel has co-opted religious sites and traditions.
Oh, okay. How so?
And this gets particularly interesting when you consider that many of these sites are sacred to multiple religions.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the Western Wall, for example.
Right.
It's a remnant of the ancient Temple Mount complex. But Aldabash argues that Israel has transformed it into this symbol of Jewish national identity, sometimes at the expense of other faiths.
Are they really kind of claiming it for themselves?
Exactly. And he even mentions the reconstruction of the Herva synagogue in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's Old City.
Okay. And what's the significance of that?
Well, the original synagogue was destroyed in 1948, and its reconstruction in 2010, despite being in this predominantly Palestinian neighborhood, is seen by Aldabash as an act of asserting Jewish dominance in a contested space.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a prime example of how religious symbols can be used as tools of power and control.
It's like a form of symbolic warfare, using architecture and religious iconography to stake a claim to the land.
Right, exactly. And it's not just physical structures either.
Okay.
Aldabash talks about how Israel has tried to appropriate Palestinian cultural traditions, presenting them as inherently Jewish.
Give me an example of that.
Like hummus and falafel, foods that have become synonymous with Israeli cuisine, despite their deep roots in Palestinian culture.
It's like they're trying to erase Palestinian identity and claim ownership of their cultural heritage.
Exactly. And this cultural appropriation, Aldabash argues, it's not just about food, it's about control over the narrative. It's about denying Palestinians their history and their right to self-determination.
It's a very powerful way of silencing a people, taking away their stories and their cultural touchstones. Okay, so we've talked about archaeology, religious sites, and cultural appropriation. What about the role of education and media in all of this?
Yeah, that's another really crucial aspect of Aldabash's analysis.
Okay.
He argues that Israel has invested heavily in shaping public opinion, both domestically and internationally. He describes it as crafting a narrative that presents Israel as this beacon of democracy surrounded by hostile enemies.
Like that classic David and Goliath story, right?
Precisely, where Israel is this small, embattled nation constantly under threat. And Aldabash argues that this narrative is deeply misleading. He points to Israel's own history of displacing Palestinians and denying them basic rights. He's saying Israel is not a victim, but an aggressor, a powerful military force that has repeatedly used its might to subdue its neighbors.
And he backs up this claim with specific historical examples.
Oh, he does. He talks about the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel captured significant territories.
Right.
The 1982 invasion of Lebanon, the ongoing siege of Gaza. He uses these events to demonstrate Israel's willingness to use force to achieve its objectives.
It sounds like he's really trying to dismantle that image of Israel as this purely defensive force.
That's exactly what he's doing. He's challenging the dominant narrative and offering a different perspective.
Okay, and he also talks about how Israel has used the media to control the narrative and shape international perceptions. Right?
Absolutely. He argues that Israel has been very successful at portraying itself as a victim of terrorism while downplaying its own actions. He points out how Israeli officials frequently use terms like self-defense and security to justify their actions, even when those actions result in the deaths of civilians or the destruction of Palestinian homes and infrastructure.
It's like the language itself is being used to manipulate perceptions.
Yeah, and it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
Aldabash provides some really chilling examples of Israeli officials dehumanizing Palestinians using terms like cockroaches and grasshoppers.
Wow.
And he argues that this kind of language, it reflects this deep-seated racism that pervades Israeli society and justifies violence against Palestinians.
It's a stark reminder of how words can be used to demonize and dehumanize entire groups of people. It's terrifying, really, when you think about the implications of that.
And Aldabash connects this dehumanizing language back to the biblical narrative.
Okay.
He points to passages that portray non-Jews as like enemies of God's chosen people, deserving of punishment.
So it's like he's suggesting that this ancient text is being used to justify modern-day actions that are clearly unjust and inhumane.
Right. It's a powerful and unsettling connection that he's making.
Yeah.
And he believes that this sense of moral superiority is a major obstacle to achieving peace because it prevents Israelis from seeing Palestinians as equals, as people deserving of respect and dignity.
Okay, so we've talked about how Israel has used archaeology, religion, education, and media to construct and maintain its narrative.
Right.
But Aldabash doesn't just focus on the external forces at play.
No.
He also delves into the internal dynamics within Israeli society.
Right. He does. And one of the most fascinating aspects of his analysis is his discussion of the internal divisions within Israeli society,
Okay.
particularly the growing polarization between secular and religious Jews.
Yeah, that's something you hear a lot about in the news these days.
Aldabash argues that this polarization is becoming increasingly pronounced, with this growing gap between those who support a more peaceful resolution to the conflict and those who hold more extreme nationalist views.
He mentions the rise of groups like the Hilltop Youth, right? Those young settlers who engage in violence against Palestinians.
Exactly. He sees them as a symptom of this growing extremism within Israeli society, an extremism that is fueled by a particular interpretation of the biblical narrative and a sense of entitlement to the land.
And he also points to the growing influence of religious parties in Israeli politics.
Yes, he argues that these parties are pushing for policies that are further entrenching the occupation and making peace more difficult to achieve.
Right.
They say the conflict in religious terms as a battle between good and evil, and they are unwilling to compromise on their vision of a greater Israel that encompasses all of the biblical land of Israel.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's a deeply concerning trend that Aldabash sees as a major obstacle to peace. He believes that this internal division within Israeli society between those who cling to an exclusivist religious narrative and those who seek a more inclusive and peaceful future, it's like a microcosm of the larger conflict itself.
So the battle over narratives is not just happening between Israelis and Palestinians.
Right.
It's also happening within Israeli society itself. It adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Absolutely. And this internal struggle within Israel is something that Aldabash believes the international community needs to pay more attention to.
How so? What does he suggest?
Well, he argues that the international community, particularly the United States, has been too willing to accept Israel's self-portrayal as a democracy under threat,
Right.
without acknowledging these internal dynamics and the extremist elements that are driving the conflict.
So he's suggesting that by turning a blind eye to these internal divisions, the international community is actually enabling the very forces that are making peace more difficult to achieve.
That's precisely his argument.
Wow.
He believes that the international community needs to be more discerning in its support for Israel.
Okay.
And needs to pressure the Israeli government to address these internal divisions and to rein in the extremist elements within its society.
It's a pretty bold statement, challenging the conventional wisdom about the conflict and the role of the international community.
Aldabash is not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. He's trying to offer a new perspective, a deeper understanding of the conflict that takes into account the historical, religious, political, and psychological factors that are at play.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the biblical roots of the Israeli narrative to the specific strategies employed by Israel to maintain control and advance its narrative. Where do we go from here?
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore Aldabash's critique of the Oslo Accords, which he sees as a major turning point in the conflict.
Okay.
We'll also delve into his insights into the strategies employed by the Palestinian resistance and how those have evolved over time. And we'll examine his views on the role of education, the diaspora, the arts, and international solidarity in challenging the dominant narrative and working toward a just and lasting peace.
That sounds fascinating. I'm eager to hear how he connects all of these different threads and what he sees as the path forward for a conflict that has seemed intractable for so long.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting discussion. So, picking up where we left off, Aldabash takes a really critical look at the Oslo Accords,
Okay.
seeing them as like a turning point in the conflict, but not necessarily in a good way.
How so?
He argues that those accords, signed back in the 90s, they were more of a trap for the Palestinians than like an actual path to peace.
A trap in what sense? How?
Well, he points out that the Oslo Accords, they didn't really address the core issues of the conflict, like the
Right.
status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the dismantling of Israeli settlements.
Mm.
Instead, he argues they created the system where Israel maintains control while appearing to make
So it
concessions.
was more about appearances than substance.
That's how Aldabash sees it. Yeah, he points to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which was tasked with administering the occupied territories, but without real power
Right.
or sovereignty. It's like giving someone the illusion of control while someone else is pulling the strings.
He also argues that the Accords essentially turned Palestinians into policing themselves for the benefit of Israel. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the Palestinian Authority was made responsible for security in the occupied territories, which Aldabash argues only served to strengthen the occupation and undermine Palestinian resistance.
Wow.
He believes that the Oslo Accords, while presented as a step towards peace, actually made it more difficult to achieve a just and lasting resolution.
Yeah, so if the Oslo Accords were a step in the wrong direction, what does Aldabash see as like the way forward? He must have some ideas about how to break this deadlock.
He does. He believes that any future peace agreement has to be based on like a true recognition of Palestinian rights and a genuine commitment to ending the occupation. He talks about this need for a fundamental shift in the balance of power, arguing that as long as Israel maintains military and economic dominance, they have no incentive to compromise.
So he's saying that the international community needs to step up and exert more pressure on Israel.
That's a big part of his argument. Yeah, he sees a need for sanctions, boycotts, or other forms of economic and political pressure to kind of push Israel towards a more just and equitable solution.
Okay.
But he also places a lot of emphasis on the power of grassroots movements and civil society organizations.
You mean groups like the BDS movement, which advocates for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel?
Exactly. He sees the BDS movement as like a prime example of this kind of strategic resistance, putting pressure on Israel while also raising awareness about the occupation.
But he acknowledges that this will be a long and difficult struggle, right?
He does. He stresses that Palestinians need to be prepared for the long haul. It's going to require patience, resilience, and a willingness to sacrifice. And he emphasizes the importance of unity among Palestinians, and building alliances with progressive forces around the world.
Right. It's a reminder that change rarely comes easily, especially in a conflict as deeply entrenched as this one.
Now, shifting gears a bit, Aldabash also has some interesting thoughts about the role of education in this conflict.
Okay.
He criticizes the way it's often taught in schools, both in Israel and Palestine, arguing that it tends to be biased and simplistic.
Yeah, what does he mean by that? What's wrong with how it's taught now?
Well, he points out that Israeli textbooks often portray Palestinians as terrorists or obstacles to peace, while Palestinian textbooks portray Israelis as aggressors.
Hmm.
This kind of one-sided education, he argues, only deepens the divide and makes peace more difficult to achieve.
Yeah, it's perpetuated the conflict rather than helping to resolve it.
Exactly. So Aldabash advocates for a more nuanced approach to education, one that presents multiple perspectives, encourages critical thinking, and fosters empathy and understanding. He believes that by exposing young people to the complexities of the conflict and the humanity of both sides, it's possible to break down barriers and create a more hopeful future.
It's a hopeful vision, but it seems like a pretty daunting task given the deep-seated animosity that exists between the two sides.
Aldabash acknowledges the challenges, but he remains optimistic.
Okay.
He believes that education has the power to transform perceptions and create the conditions for peace and reconciliation.
Hmm.
It's about planting seeds of understanding and empathy that can hopefully blossom into a more peaceful future.
Yeah, it's an inspiring thought, and it makes you realize that even in the midst of such a long and bitter conflict, there are still people working towards peace and understanding. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring Aldabash's critical analysis of the Israeli narrative, his examination of the power dynamics at play, and his thoughts on the role of education and resistance. What's the one key takeaway that you hope our listeners walk away with?
Well, I think Aldabash's work ultimately emphasizes the power of narratives in shaping our understanding of history and influencing our actions in the present.
Hmm.
He challenges us to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives we're presented with, and to seek out diverse perspectives. And most importantly, I think he reminds us that even in the face of, seemingly insurmountable obstacles, hope for a more just and peaceful future is possible, if we're willing to challenge the status quo and work towards a better world.
It's a powerful message and one that's particularly relevant, I think, in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information and competing narratives.
Yeah.
Aldabaş's work encourages us to be more discerning, more critical, and more engaged in our search for truth and understanding. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in building a more just and peaceful world.
Yeah, this deep dive into Aldabaş's work has hopefully challenged you to think critically, to question assumptions, and to consider different perspectives. It's a reminder that the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict demand our continued attention and engagement.
If narratives can be so powerful, we have a responsibility to examine them, especially those that shape conflicts and impact millions of lives. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we encourage you to continue exploring the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a critical lens.